All right. So hello again, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar on global advocacy entry points to advance refugee self-reliance as we look ahead to the Global Refugee Forum Progress Review in December. My name is Simar Singh, and I am a technical advisor to the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative and Chief Program Officer at Refuge Point. It's wonderful to see so many people join the call. Please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. We are really interested in knowing who you are and where you're calling in from today. There was a lot of interest in this webinar, so I'm glad that we have a good group that were able to join. For those of you who are less familiar with the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative or the RSRI, we are a global network of over 450 operational and policy NGOs, international organizations, UN agencies, government agencies, funders, refugee-led groups, and other stakeholders, all working together to promote and advance refugee self-reliance. We do this by building evidence, influencing policy and practice, and connecting partners around a shared goal of expanding opportunities for refugees and other forcibly displaced populations to become self-reliant and achieve their goals. So today's session comes at an important moment. As all of you are well aware, our entire sector and the communities that we serve have been impacted by the dramatic shifts in the policy and funding environment this year. At the same time, we've heard from our network, from all of you on this call, that you remain deeply committed to forging ahead with our collective goal of helping refugees achieve the best version of self-reliance possible amidst all of these shifts. So today's session is about just that, looking forward as preparations are underway for the Global Refugee Forum Progress Review in December. We have an opportunity to examine where partnerships, advocacy, and our participation can most effectively advance refugee self-reliance within the framework of the Global Compact on Refugees. As many of you know, self-reliance is one of the 4 objectives of the Global Compact, and this meeting in December will be an opportunity to review progress made towards that objective, particularly through efforts like the global multi-stakeholder pledge on economic inclusion and social protection, a pledge that the RSRI and UNHCR are co-leading with several other partners. Our discussion today will feature insights from UNHCR's Global Compact on Refugees team, from UNHCR's Sustainable Response Services, and our seat, each offering unique perspectives on entry points for advocacy and engagement ahead of the progress review. I'm delighted to welcome our speakers for today's webinar, Nicolas, who's the head of the Global Compact on Refugees Coordination Team, Kahin Ismail, who's the Chief of Self-Reliance and Inclusion at UNHCR's Sustainable Response Services, and Marisa Leon Gomez Sonet, who is the Partnerships and Stakeholders Advisor at our seat. Our agenda for today includes remarks from each of our speakers, followed by some time for Q&A. If you do have questions as we go along, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll collect them and bring them up during the Q&A. Or you can save them and sort of directly ask the questions in our time for Q&A and discussion at the end. All right, with that, I will turn it over to the first of our speakers, Nicolas, who will walk us through the Global Compact on Refugees, the GRF Progress Review, what they are, why they matter. Nicolas, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Simar, and thank you to RSRI for having us, having me today for this very timely and important webinar. I hope you can hear me well. I will have a few slides to guide you through my 10 minutes intervention, and I will kindly ask Ali, was the first to introduce herself in the chat, if she could just start and press next on the slide so I can dive into the topic. And I appreciate that maybe many of you joining today's call may not be as familiar, as Sima said, with the Global Compact on Refugees, with the Global Refugee Forum, and the Global Refugee Forum Progress Review. So here, what you can see on the slide, or what you could see, now it's all black, but it's basically a summary of what the GCR, what the Global Compact on Refugees is all about. And I think this is where also history does matter. Sima referred to the policy and financial shifts that we have been experiencing for the past year or so, and many are talking about a new norms, a new normal paradigm shift, and so on. If we're true to ourselves, I think a lot of the challenges and the new norms, as we're saying, we've been facing them for a number of years. And the Global Compact on Refugees, together with the Global Compact on Migration, finds its actually genesis in such in a very similar context back in mid 2010s, in 2015 in particular. And many of you will remember the refugee and migrant situation in Europe. So back to the topic at hand, Global Compact on Refugees, which was developed as a result of a very of a norm of circumstances that actually were something that very much in line with what we're experiencing today. And you will recall, I'm sure, the difficult situation and the refugee and migrant situation in the Mediterranean Sea in 2015, 2016. So both compacts on refugees and on migration find their roots in the New York Declaration in 2016 on refugees and migrants. And so both compacts were developed subsequently, and the Global Compact on Refugees was affirmed or adopted by the UN General Assembly in December 2018. So it's about to turn 7 years old. So it's still in its infancy in a certain way, but a lot has happened. As Sima mentioned, self-reliance is one of the 4 key objectives of the Global Compact on Refugees, which is an objective around enhancing refugee self-reliance, together with 3 other objectives. One is on easing the pressures on host countries and communities. The third one on expanding access to third country solutions. So here we're talking about resettlement, but not only. We're also talking about complementary pathways, labor mobility, which is very relevant for today's discussion, as well as supporting conditions in countries of origin for return in safety and dignity. What's really important about the Global Compact on Refugees is that it is not binding. It's not a treaty, it's not a convention, and it's really about broadening the base of responders to refugee situations. And this notion of whole of society approach was very much pioneered through the compact, and it's really one of the key features of that document. And if we look at the way actors and stakeholders have engaged into the Global Compact on Refugees implementation, that's something really we see as a key success and achievement in terms of broadening that base of actors, including those that work at the grassroots level, starting with refugee-led organizations, of course, local actors, private sector actors, but also cities, faith leaders, and so on, of course, in addition to I would say, maybe the usual suspects, such as states, of course, as well as UN entities. Next slide. So the way the Global Compact on Refugees is implemented through different ways, establishment of networks of cooperation, support platforms, and so on. But the main implementation tool is through pledges made at Global Refugee Forums, which take place every 4 years. So there have been 2 took place so far. The first one was in 2019, and the second one in 2023. In between 2 Global Refugee Forums, the Compact asks the community to gather at a high level, at a senior official level, to take stock. It's a bit of like a midway point between 2 Global Refugee Forums. So that moment will take place this December, from the 15th to the 17th of December at the CICG in Geneva. So for those of you who may not be familiar with Geneva, this is the International Conference Center. It's really close to UNHCR headquarters. And the level of participation is not expected to be at the same level as the Global Refugee Forum, for those of you who attended in December 2023. Yet it will be a very important moment because of the context that Sima described so eloquently in her introduction. So we really want to make this meeting count, and this is why it's so important to engage. Now, engaging into a one-off moment doesn't really do the trick, obviously. So it's been part of this will be a milestone as part of a broader journey that really has started since January 2024 and after the Global Refugee Forum 2023, whereby we've been really working on implementing a number of pledges, individual pledges made under the compact, including some that were linked to thematic pledges or mega pledges, which we call multi-stakeholder pledges. And there is one in particular on economic inclusion and social protection, and I think my colleague Kahin will speak into more details. Overall, there have been, since 2019, over 3,400 pledges, and more than half have been fulfilled or are in progress, which is good news, which is a sign of engagement and delivery. Now, of course, as we speak, we have been faced, and when I say we, it's an entire ecosystem faced with major shifts, and we know that the achievements and progress remains very fragile and are directly threatened by the funding shortfalls. So this meeting in December comes at a very timely point to really encourage renewed commitments from all actors, including, of course, states, hosting states, but also donors, but also reflect together in terms of what has worked well, what are the challenges, where do we need to correct course, and where do we need to invest further, mindful of this new sort of the shifts that Sima referred to. The meeting will be in the spirit of the Global Compact on Refugees, so it is not meant to be a formal UN moment. We really want to give space to all stakeholders under the Global Compact. So the tone, we're really working very hard on the program to make sure the tone will be less formal, but it will give priority to statements of impact. We want to hear from those that have pledged, that have been actually working on the ground. We want to hear about the opportunities, but also the challenges. One key element of that meeting, and one of the key elements of the Global Compact on Refugees, is really about the meaningful participation of people with lived experience, of course, including refugees. And we really want to maintain the same level of participation as we had at the Global Refugee Forum. And this is really about meaningful participation, meaning not having a tokenistic approach, ensuring that we have actually the right people in the room who will contribute with their expertise, not just because they have lived experience, but for what they're bringing to the discussion. And we have been working very hard, including with colleagues from our seat, for instance, to really prepare for that at that meeting, but I'm sure Marisa will speak into more details. The meeting is on, I see also some questions in the chat, so I'll address that. The meeting is on invitation only, but it will be broadcast live, so you can follow the meeting, the plenary debate online. And for more details, I've added the link to the frequently asked questions document we have prepared. Next slide. I'm speeding up a little bit. So this, I hope you can see on the screen, this is the mapping of the themes that will be touched upon during the meeting. And it really spans across situations or across different thematic priorities directly linked to the 4 objectives of the compact. And obviously, we want to make sure that we really do justice to today's challenges. So this is where, obviously, speaking of entry points for actors working around refugee self-reliance, obviously there is a series of moments, side events, thematic sessions that will take place in plenary debate, where that will really dive into that topic. We know how important building, enhancing refugee self-reliance is in terms of also not only working towards integration, inclusion, but also preparing a better, more sustainable returns when conditions are met in countries of origin. So we also want to show and make sure we showcase all the importance of connecting the dots with tertiary education, for instance, with inclusion in national systems. And that's where actually our approach to sustainable responses is so essential, and Kahin will also speak to this. So these are the moments where it will be the possibility to engage and to leverage that meeting. And we'll have also a series of, in addition to those side events, a series of linked events. So linked events are not happening on site at the conference center, but are usually organized by partners the week before and the week during the event in connection with the official program of the GRF Progress Review, and they will be listed in the official program precisely. Next and last slide. So how to engage for you colleagues? Obviously, for those of you who are engaged in the multi-stakeholder pledges, starting with the economic inclusion and social protection one, this would be the main entry point to prepare really for engaging at the meeting in December. But of course, there are other entry points, including liaising with partners directly, including states, of course. And we really count on your support also to make sure that delegations include people with lived experience in their composition. So we make that call with member states, but also with different actors who will be joining the meeting in December. Last but not the least, for those of you who do not be here in person, of course, I mentioned it's possible to follow the meeting online, but there are also ways of submitting content, reports, video messages, all sorts of in the digital form that will be posted in a specific space online that we call digital space precisely, that will actually be able to give also visibility to good practices, achievements that have been delivered by a number of stakeholders that have been working towards including building self-reliance for refugees among different themes. I'll stop here. Sima, apologies for having taken a bit longer, but I hope you will have some sympathy on that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Nicolas, for sharing all of that information. And I think in particular, for all of us here, there are so many terms and processes and entry points as we are trying to follow the Global Compact on Refugees, the GRFs, the progress review. Some of the names have changed. So I really appreciate that you led us clearly through what that process is. And I think importantly as well, one of the points that you mentioned is that the progress review is a moment in time. It's not sort of the only moment at which we can sort of influence the agenda or engage in it, but it is sort of an important moment that's coming up in December. So it's really helpful to keep in mind all of the different points that you mentioned. And I think the other thing that I'll uplift here is, as you noted, this is really intended to be a platform for multi-stakeholder engagement. This is not just a conversation between states, and I really appreciate that you highlighted how there are efforts being made to create space for more voices and more perspectives to be present. And that, of course, is of interest to our network over here. So thank you, Nicolas. I see there are a couple of questions in the chat, and we'll hold those until the Q&A. Next, I'll turn it over to Kahin. Kahin, please, we are eager to hear from you. I'm sure you'll talk about the multi-stakeholder pledge on economic inclusion and social protection, but also other ways in which you see entry points focused on self-reliance ahead of the GRF progress review. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Simar, and thank you, RSRI, for organizing this webinar in lead up to the GRF review. It's really important to engage with you, and thank you very much for all the work that we've been done together over the last few years in lead up to the last GRF and continuing on that. One of the things that we are really proud of is the fact that that community of support to the economic inclusion and social protection led in many ways RSRI continued their work after the GRF to build on the successes and the pledge. And this webinar is obviously part of that. So we're really happy to reconvene at this. As both of you mentioned, both Nicolas and Simar, in terms of self-reliance, obviously that is a key feature in the Global Compact as the second pillar of that. And that's something that we've been focusing on, and this multi-stakeholder pledge specifically has been really driving forward on that respect. And self-reliance is a multi-dimensional concept, and economic inclusion is at its core. And for us as UNHCR, we've been focusing more on the enabling refugee inclusion in national systems and services, including labor market, financial inclusion, social protection, resilience building, and social cohesion to drive and promote self-reliance and prepare for dual solutions. What this means is basically aligning skills, for example, just to be more specific and more focused in terms of what activities that entails skills development for market needs, but also ensuring refugees can work and operate and open businesses and access to land for agriculture, and enabling freedom of movement to pursue opportunities locally or across borders as well. It also means expanding access to financial services to get paid, to take loans, send and receive remittances as well, and protecting rights in general at work, and including fair wage, safe conditions, and access to formal employment. And in all these areas that we work with a number of partners, including ILO, which is part also of this economic inclusion, social protection network of conveners and supporters as well. So there are a number of intersectionality with the different actors in terms of driving this forward in a meaningful way, in a concrete way, but also in terms of advocacy, but also directly working with refugees, host governments and others to drive this position forward. But as we know, and we have been discussing this in many occasions in these forums as well, is that despite progress in legal frameworks, and we have seen some progress in that from the 2019 GRF to 2013, we have seen some progress with regard to legal frameworks, with regard to the enabling environment in general, but still we see a significant gap remaining between the rights to work and access to in practice. So we've been monitoring in this, and we have a data that we've been collecting from all operations in terms of how we see the progress being made. And for example, in 2025, UNHCR data from 96 countries shows that while 62% of refugees have the legal right to work officially, only 47 have unrestricted access to formal employment. And this is due to administrative barriers. This is due to delays in documentations, other administrative barriers such as high permit costs and non-recognition of qualifications. So all these different aspects, even where refugees have access to access to work in law, there's a significant barriers that still exists in terms of administrative, but also other practices. Also, refugee women face additional challenges, including unpaid care responsibilities, restrictive norms, unsafe transport, and heightened risk of gender-based violence. Refugees are often confined to low skills, informal sectors, and we have seen that in many contexts where exploitation risks are high. Mobility restrictions, skills gaps, digital and financial inclusion also limit access to decent work and entrepreneurship in many contexts. We see when it comes to self-reliance, and especially in the domain of access to jobs, self-employment and decent work as well, the private sector is often a key partner in this regard. But in many situations, we see that they are unaware of refugee rights, right to work, and how to engage with them. And this limits opportunities for employment, partnership, and inclusive business models. We try to improve that in terms of expanding our collaboration across. We have, for example, on the private sector side, collaboration with the International Financial Corporation, IFC, which is part of the World Bank Group. We have a joint initiative to really bring businesses and private sector engagement in refugee housing areas. And we're seeing some progress in that regard in different contexts and in different operations as well. But efforts to support livelihood and promote economic inclusion are over-fragmented still and disconnected from national systems. And this is something that we've been focusing on sustainable response service, and as our strategy is now being developed based on that. Partnerships tend to be short-term and transactional, with limited coordination across humanitarian, development, and private sector actors. And gaps in disaggregated data and weak monitoring frameworks further constrain effective programming and accountability. And these are some of the things and some of the structural limitations that we want to overcome. In terms of opportunity to influence, in terms of advocacy, this is why we need to move beyond short-term projects and fragmented efforts. And the sustainable response approach that has been launched and now being implemented and across UNHCR operations, but also in partnership with the host government and with others, promotes basically a nationally led integrated strategies that strengthen systems and support long-term solutions. It aligns humanitarian and protection efforts with national development and economic planning, helping to reduce reliance on humanitarian aid and fostering self-reliance and resilience for refugees and displaced populations. This approach is grounded in meaningful participation, and that is one key aspect in terms of our localization, in terms of engagement of refugees, tailored to national priorities, because each context is different, each situation is slightly different from others in terms of the enabling environment, but also opportunities available for refugees and host communities and other displaced populations. So it is designed to empower displaced and host communities, including through inclusion in education. And we need to make that link, learning to earning, education, and health and employment and social protection systems. So it's not a standalone focus on economic inclusion, but also to really look at other aspects and other factors that would enhance and promote that going forward. In terms of the Global Compact on Refugees and the GRF, this really provided us a global platform to align efforts. And this was obviously, as I mentioned, the GRF Multi-Stakeholder Pledge on Economic Inclusion and Social Protection, which was launched in 2023, was a milestone in advancing refugee self-reliance. It's brought together over 280 pledges. I think it's one of the highest pledges made in the GRF from states, companies, UN agencies, NGOs, civil society, and academia. And for those of you not too familiar, the pledge was co-led by RSRI, IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development in East and Horn Africa, the government of Denmark, the governments of Denmark, Germany, Mexico, and the Netherlands and the United States. And it was supported by UNHCR. We also had a number of technical co-conveners, including ILO, Innovation for Poverty Action, the PAC, the Poverty Alleviation Coalition, and 10th Partnership for Refugees. There was also a number of technical contributors, such as IFC, the World Bank, and the Joint Data Center on Forced Displacement, JPAL, OECD, UNICEF, and others as well. ODI, the European Union, not to forget them as well, their contribution. So that multi-stakeholder pledge, as many of you would know, was structured around 3 pillars. One was law and policy reform, inclusive programming, and data and evidence. On the last point, data is the key to influence policy, measuring refugee contributions and track impact. For the Refugee Progress Review in December, we are organizing an event on employment focusing on policy and partnerships, including labor mobility, together with our colleagues working on international protection and solutions. I will share with you more on the details as we develop this side event. Refugees want to work and to be self-reliant, and that is a fact, and that is something that we've been, as a point of entry and advocacy, is very important to highlight the contribution they're already making, even in contexts where there's a lot of restriction is still imposed on them. You would find that in many contexts, refugees contribute significantly to the local economy, and to dismantle these barriers will only enhance their contribution and engagement and involvement in local economies. And government and private sectors are increasingly creating enabling environment, but advocacy is still needed, especially in fragile contexts. And therefore, that is really crucial for us to promote inclusion in the economy, in social protection systems, recognize refugees' fiscal contributions, and counter refugee narratives, anti-refugee narratives in this context. And that it means basically to really highlight and not to diminish the contribution, but also to really elevate the conversation and the contribution that refugees make, and to really build on that. That when that happens, and when data is brought and used and evidence is used in that regard in terms of building that narrative, we find that host governments and others are really receptive to receiving that advocacy and that message. And that is something that we've been focusing on in working with many other partners in this. The global shortage, for example, in skills and labor is another compelling reason in terms of advocacy point to invest in refugee economic inclusion. Refugees remain unrepresented in global labor markets, and that is a missed opportunity. Global advocacy, therefore, is essential for us, but it must be complemented by regional and national efforts and strong coordination across all levels and across all actors. That's where communities or practices like RSRI play a vital role, connecting actors, sharing knowledge, and driving collective progress. And this is something that we hope to build on as we now move towards and approach the Global Refugee Forum review in December. So maybe I will stop there for now. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Kahin. Really, really helpful to hear your perspectives in terms of where UNHCR is going with the focus on sustainable approaches, what that means, and where you sort of see the greatest impact for advocacy, in terms of some of those focus areas on inclusion. Also very helpful to hear from you about the multi-stakeholder pledge on economic inclusion and social protection. And as you mentioned, it's economic inclusion is, of course, often the focal point, and I think the easiest place for many of us working on self-reliance to focus our efforts and our thoughts, but it is that broader focus on inclusion, including social protection and other linked pieces where there are, in fact, quite a few opportunities. So taking that broader view, as you mentioned, is definitely something that I know will be of interest to many of the people on this call. Thank you again for highlighting, sort of where you're seeing a lot of the promise and potential for members of our network to play a role in advocacy, in policy engagement. I think a lot of the points that you mentioned really resonated with what we're hearing from our network in terms of where different groups are focusing their efforts. And I know that there are already a couple of questions coming up in the chat that we'll take during the Q&A. There was some interest in some of the numbers you were mentioning early on in terms of the impact that we're seeing from the multi-stakeholder pledge. So if you are able to share some of those numbers again in the chat, I think there was some interest in being able to really understand that quantification that you mentioned. And we'll also make sure that we follow up and share that data with everyone in the summary from this webinar. So thank you again, Kahin. And we'll now move to Marisa from RSEAT. Marisa, welcome. And we are eager to hear from you about RSEAT's work. And in particular, if you have thoughts on ways in which refugee leaders and those of us supporting refugee leaders can meaningfully engage through these global processes. I know that RSEAT has a lot of training for moments like this, for events like this. So anything that you have to share in terms of what has worked well, what RSEAT is doing, advice that you have for folks on this call is most welcome. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simar, and thank you for the invitation to this panel. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. So I'll be speaking a little bit about the work that we do, and as you mentioned, the trainings and some entry points for advocacy, some of which have already been mentioned from my fellow panelists, but I will be speaking specifically from an RLO perspective. So RSEAT stands for Refugee Seeking Equal Access at the Table. We're a global refugee-led organization focused on advancing meaningful refugee participation as a tool to enhance global refugee policy. For us at RSEAT, meaningful refugee participation is not the end goal, but rather a way to make policy much more effective, sustainable, and grounded in the realities that refugees face on the ground. With this, the GCR is a critical framework for us to advance meaningful refugee participation. As Nicolas mentioned in his intervention, meaningful refugee participation is a central piece of the GCR, particularly through paragraph 34, which states that responses are much more effective when refugees are meaningfully engaged. So we use the GCR and paragraph 34 as a way to advance our advocacy with states and other stakeholders because they were committed to this when they signed it up through the General Assembly in 2018. So a key part of our work is to open spaces for refugee-led organizations and refugee leaders. And in particular, in the GRF 2023, we did several of these initiatives to ensure that refugee voices and their advice and their presence was there at the forum. Particularly, we work with governments very closely, trying to have as many governments as possible to include refugee advisors in their delegations. As we all know, it is states, it is governments who have the ultimate decision-making power, and that's why it's very important for us to have refugee advisors in government delegations. Particularly, we work with countries that have created refugee advisory boards, for instance, Canada, Germany, New Zealand, Australia, and most recently, Germany. RSEAT is also working with countries like Switzerland, Portugal, Uganda, Kenya, Brazil, so that they also establish refugee advisory boards and they institutionalize refugee participation and include refugee advisors in their delegations to global refugee meetings. RSEAT also facilitated and sponsored the participation of one person of 11 RLOs in the past GRF, and we also did the We Are All Here campaign, which ensured that voices that couldn't be physically present in Geneva could make it through other avenues, for instance, through banners and other physical materials that we distributed in the forum to ensure that their voices could be heard and read by important stakeholders. But one particular thing that we do with every meeting of the Global Refugee System, not just the Global Refugee Forum, is provide training to refugee advocates and to RLOs in general to prepare them to engage with international Geneva. Refugees are experts, they're thematic experts. They have a lot of knowledge, not only because of their lived experience, but also because they're the first responders for the needs of their communities. But they might lack the knowledge of the technical aspects of how Geneva works and how they can access the spaces and how can they most get out of their advocacy when they're here present in Geneva. So we have offered training prior to XCOM, the executive committee meetings that happen every October. We have done it for the CRCP, the Complementary and Resettlement Conference that happens in June. And we do so as well with the Global Refugee Forum and the Progress Review coming up in December of 2025. This year, we have had the pleasure to partner with the International Institute of Humanitarian Law and UNHCR for the training. It has already started. It started last week, and it will go up for 6 weeks in the lead up to the Global Refugee Forum Progress Review until the first week of December. The training is hosted in 6 time zones and in 4 different languages. We have English, Arabic, Spanish, and French. So if you have, if you're working with a refugee leader or you're a refugee leader yourself or an RLO and you're coming to the progress review and would like to be part of this training, please do get in touch with us. Even though it has already started, it is quite early and you can still engage with what's rest of it. The trainings are a mix of academic papers, practical guides, lectures, and guest talks, as well as live sessions for 6 weeks in which refugee leaders talk amongst themselves, they talk with experts and ensure that they have the advocacy skills and the knowledge to engage with the global refugee system. It is helpful for those that have been to Geneva before and have some knowledge on it, as well as those that are completely new to the system. But more broadly, going beyond the training and the work that RSEED has done, I think a key point for advocacy has already been mentioned by my fellow panelists, and that is that RLOs and refugees can engage at the global level through the multi-stakeholder pledges. I think particularly if you're interested in a thematic topic, for instance, in self-reliance, you can look up the pledge and the commitments that different stakeholders have done so under that pledge. Or you can also be interested in, for instance, states or countries. Like if you're working in Kenya, you can see the commitments that Kenya have made at the global level and ensure that your advocacy can be heard here in Geneva, but also at capital level. So it's important to make the link with the national and the international. A lot of the advocacy actually can happen or should happen before the meeting and after the meeting. We have always said that the GRF is, or the progress review, it's like the wedding, but the actual marriage happens, before and after. So that engagement to keep it going, it's very important. And it's not only what happens here in December in this particular gathering. RLOs have engaged as co-leads in the implementation of certain pledges. For instance, Bundeco Livelihoods Initiative in the localization pledge is leading with IGVA and UNHCR. So it's important that refugees and RLOs can be part of the decision-making process of the implementation and that they are especially co-leads. It's a very important thing to see. Some multi-stakeholder pledges have established or have refugee advisory groups. So for instance, the refugee advisory group that advises on the CRCP is also very much engaged in the multi-stakeholder pledge on resettlement and complementary pathways. So that's another way in which refugee leaders can be brought into the implementation and development of pledges. And finally, there's the meeting itself. Coming to the meeting, being able to have bilateral conversations with states, with different government officials, with NGOs and other stakeholders is very much crucial. So in our training, for instance, we provide a whole session in which we practice an elevator pitch and how can refugee leaders engage and put across their points when they're talking to these officials that are usually very pressed in time and it's hard to get access to them. So we ensure that they are prepared to have good advocacy and that they can make their points across. Similarly, there's pathways for advocacy at the regional level. So for instance, our seat has been engaging through the Cartagena Plus 40 pledge and the process of Cartagena Plus 40. We were present in Chile when they were signing the Cartagena process, and particularly Carlos, which I see a couple of members here on the call, is a network of RLOs that has been very much engaged in that pledge and in Cartagena Plus 40 and ensuring that refugee protection and responses in the Latin American region are more effective and have the particular expertise and advice from the refugee-led and refugee lived experience perspective. There is another way in which you can engage as well if you're a refugee-led organization or refugee, which is the refugee statement. This is a statement that will be read by a refugee leader in the plenary of the progress review. So there's various rounds of reviews on the refugee statement, and if you're a person with lived experience engaging in the progress review, it is a way in which you can put across your advocacy and your messaging. And finally, I will end with the R space. I know Nicolas mentioned all the linked events that are happening in Geneva parallel to the progress review. And the R space specifically is a space that will run for the 3 consecutive days of the progress review, in which refugee leaders will host their own events, will have their own priorities and their own agendas. And additionally, another aspect of that is that they do not need to be formally invited to the progress review to engage in the our space. So that's another way in which we're working to opening those doors and ensuring that refugees can engage with stakeholders. Most of the stakeholders that will be present on the progress review at one point or another come to the R space as well. So there is that parallel link that can happen even if they're not present in the main plenary. And with that, I'll stop and just happy to engage with anyone on this call who is working with RLOs and refugee leaders and who want to increase their participation and their advocacy at the progress review and beyond. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Marisa. Really, really helpful information, and very much appreciate your emphasis on different pathways and different levels at which refugee leaders can engage in advocacy. So while we are talking about the Global Refugee Forum Progress Review in December, I really like the way in which you put it, that's sort of the wedding, but the relationship continues sort of before and after. And I think that's very helpful for all of us on the call to think about. But I really appreciate that you mentioned, there are, of course, multiple avenues and events, our space, the linked events, the formal agenda in Geneva, but there are also these other moments to influence and engage in advocacy and policy discussions at the national level, at the regional level, all of which will then feed up to the global level. Thank you also for outlining some of the training that RC provides. There are a number of questions in the chat. I think a lot of interest in that. So if there's more information that you can share, either through links in the chat, that would be very helpful. I know there's quite a bit of interest in that as well. Great. Well, we have about 15 minutes left on this webinar, and thank you to everyone who's put questions in the chat. We'll take a handful of those, and we'll also have an opportunity for folks who might have been holding off. And so let me pause here and see if there's anyone who would like to ask a question directly to the panelists. Please feel free to raise your hand. Winston, I see you were quick to raise your hand, so maybe over to you first, and then we'll take some of the questions that were in the chat. Winston, please, over to you.
Oh, thank you so much. My name is Winston Barry Kulunji, and I'm currently living in South Africa. Thank you for this platform and for sharing the important information for its of impact to refugees all around the globe, particularly LGBTQI displaced individuals. I personally work with Haven of Pride Africa, and we are trying to leverage resources to uplift and support these vulnerable populations in South Africa. My comments are, it's great to see the Global Compact on Refugees being leveraged to support refugee self-reliance, for it is key to unlocking our potential and contributing to the host communities. And my question is, what are the specific advocacy entry points being explored to advance refugee self-reliance? And then the biggest challenges facing refugees in achieving self-reliance and how they can be addressed. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Winston. Hopefully through some of the comments that have come in or the interventions by our panelists, they've already started to answer your question, but maybe I'll give this as an opportunity to our panelists to come in and maybe pick, from your perspectives, is there one advocacy point or area where you see the most promise as it relates to self-reliance? I know all of you talked about many different things. Self-reliance is a very large concept, but is there one place that you're seeing a lot of promise in this moment in time? Maybe to respond to Winston's question. Feel free to jump in, Kahin, Marisa, Nicolas.
Yeah, maybe I can start. Yeah, exactly. No, I think advocacy and for me, for us, a key issue that we've been highlighting in this regard was how do we use really data and information that we all have to really highlight the contribution that refugees already make to the host community in terms of the economic domain as well. And we have partnered with, for example, with the World Bank, with the International Financial Corporation, IFC. And I recall years back, IFC has published this study called, it was in the context of Kenya and Kakuma refugee camp, Kakuma as a marketplace. This is before, as you know, there's a lot of restrictions still, incumbent policies in place, but still within that context, there was a lot of economic activities, economic opportunities, economic drive being actually led by refugees. And this study showed that refugees, even in that restrictive environment, and imagine if the enabling environment improves, imagine if there's a more engagement from the private sector, how that can be enhanced and scaled. And that shows really that that economic inclusion aspect, and that study really showed that there are opportunities. Refugees are not only recipients of aid and humanitarian assistance, but they are people with the skills. They are people who are already working in their communities. There are people who are contributing economically, and that really showed that there is an opportunity and market opportunity actually for the private sector. Because when we talk about economic inclusion and self-reliance, it is all about jobs. And for jobs, it is the private sector that drives the jobs. It is not the government who is going to, especially in situations where macroeconomic situation is already difficult. It's the private sector. So to showcase the refugees' contribution, refugee skills, that study really for us was an eye-opener. And that is really open up the whole space for more engagement, for more involvement, for more engagement, reform in the regulatory framework to ease that situation. So that's sort of a piece of advocacy and data-driven advocacy is really important for all of us together. And there's a lot of information now coming in that we work with the World Bank, for example. We have a joint initiative at the Global Data Center, and that is really where we focus on in terms of using data as an advocacy tool to promote self-reliance of refugees.
Thank you, Kahin. Excellent point. Focus on evidence and data and sharing information on what works. Marisa, Nicolas, would either of you like to add anything to that?
Marisa, you want to go first?
Of questions, I can on another one too, but go ahead.
Sure. I think I just want to echo the importance of refugee participation when it comes to implementing pledges or any work related to self-reliance. I mean, as Kahin just said, refugees are more than recipients of aid. They can be co-creators and implementers when it comes to this type of topics, specifically right now with such a huge focus from UNHCR and sustainable responses. I would just do a strong message that UNHCR works closely with refugee communities, with refugee leaders and their organizations to ensure that, you know, the practical aspect of self-reliance is very much done in collaboration and co-creation with refugee leaders and their organizations.
Great, thank you, Marisa. And one additional point that I'll add as well, and this is something that the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative has really been thinking about with many of you on this call, with our network. It is, of course, impossible to separate the shifting operational context from our goal of self-reliance and recognizing with the policy shifts, with the funding shifts. Nicolas, you spoke to this earlier as well. Our goal of helping refugees become and stay self-reliant seems harder than ever, but also more important than ever. And one of the things we've been thinking about is how to, in many ways, go back to, as an advocacy point, starting with a reminder that self-reliance remains a crucial goal, and of course, a very important one, particularly in this current environment. So in some ways, Winston, I think your question is both around you know, what are some of these specific points, more evidence, more direct participation from refugee leaders, but it's also about continuing to make the case for why self-reliance should be supported at this point in time. So thank you for highlighting that. We have just a few more minutes, and I did want to lift up one of the questions that was, I think perhaps one of the first questions in the chat from Jawed Babai. Jawed was asking, have there been any efforts made to initiate talks with donors or funders to keep refugees on their agenda, given the current crisis in funding? And so I'm wondering, Nicolas, Kahin, Marisa, from your perspectives, how are you seeing donors or funders engaged in the GRF progress review, particularly given their very crucial role in financing all of the wonderful pledges and commitments that we're making? Is there anything on the role of funders that you would like to highlight?
Maybe I can come in first on that one, because it's a thanks for the question, and it's a good one, and there are many angles there. So first of all, you know, drawing a line between recipients and funders is a bit difficult, and I would not advise to do so, because we do have a number of pledging entities under the Global Refugee Forum that have made policy pledges, such as host countries policies, and pledging towards conducive policy and legal frameworks that facilitate ultimately refugee self-reliance, access to work, but that's also where, for instance, freedom of movement is so essential. And then yes, there are indeed financial pledges that have been made, but one can support a policy pledge for different ways. Financing is essential, obviously, but also technical expertise, advocacy. Now, the question pertains to how we have been engaging with those actors in the lead up to the GRF progress review, mindful of the current environment. And I think that's one of the challenges these days, and it goes way beyond our conversation around refugee response. It's about an entire architecture and the way we've been thinking in terms of official development assistance system from the 90s and so on. Is it still fit for purpose? So we are one, if you will, one circle of discussions, part of a bigger bubble of considerations here. And what we are doing is for various consultations. So we've been having a series of preparatory meetings for the GRF progress review. The next one is on the 18th of November. This is when also the GCR indicator report will be launched. I think there was a comment on in the chat, which is a very important document also to measure progress and impact and advancement against the 4 GCR objectives. And going back to the point on data, and that's to answer that question as well, it's really important that we are using any opportunity at any level with any type of counterpart to bust some myth, debunk some myth around access to job and refugee self-reliance. And Kahin and Marisa explained that very eloquently, so I won't repeat what they said. But we're having these conversations with all actors, the host countries, the sort of donor partners, to make sure that indeed forced displacement, refugee matters don't fall off the overall agenda, because this is also, we cannot take for granted the support and the engagement that we've seen so far, and that's why this meeting in December matters so much. But it's part of a broader journey, and it's hopefully it will be a 8-year anniversary of a marriage, and we'll have many more to come after that, because it's essential that we are able to demonstrate the power of the collective, the international solidarity and multilateralism. And this is what's at risk now. Actually, it's even attacked. So if we collectively are not able to demonstrate that, then there's a bigger question out there. But I strongly believe, and evidence is there, and will demonstrate that when there is commitment, when the talk is walked, one can deliver impactful changes. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Nicolas. That's I think some inspiring and good words that to close our session on. I know that there were a bunch of other questions in the chat. We are coming to the end of time, and so what I'll suggest is we'll follow up with all of our speakers to get responses to some of these other questions, and we'll make sure that we include them in the summary from this webinar that we send out with the recording. We'll also get links to all of the incredible resources, Marisa, that you mentioned from our seat. Nicolas, you mentioned the digital space, and you put a link in the chat as well. And then Kahin, you were sharing some very impactful numbers that I know there's a lot of interest around as well. All right, with that, I will just say a big thank you to everyone who joined this webinar, who asked for this webinar. I think it really showcases the fact that amidst the challenging policy and funding environment, there is still a collective interest in focusing on self-reliance. And I know that all eyes are on the progress review coming up in December. As you've heard today, there are many opportunities in advance of that meeting to engage or start to engage in advocacy and policy influence. So I hope that this webinar today gave more information on how all of us, part of the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative network, can work together to shape some of that engagement and advocacy ahead of the GRF progress review. A big thank you to our speakers for joining us. As I mentioned, we'll be following up with a recording and more resources. Thank you so much, everyone. And
thank you, Simar. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.